نحن في السودان نحن بس يا وتبان ونحن في جبال نحن بس يا وكمان نلم سوا نعمل قوة نبني بلد نلم سوا نعمل قوة نبني بلد.
Arab and Black African. How is it played out in these conflicts?
The birth of the modern Sudanese state was kind of hijacked by an elite that see themselves, you know, if you talk about certain factions of some of these elite that have taken over Sudan from independence, they see themselves as the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad.
That there's unity in diversity, and that diversity is not a thing to divide or to take people apart, but to bring them together.
Okay, welcome to Pan-African Attitude, Episode 3. We have a very, very important topic, a topic very close to my heart as someone of Sudanese descent. And we have a very, very special panel to discuss this very important topic. So I'm going to start with my co-host, Sefu Sani. She actually organised a community event in Matare, is that how I pronounce it? Matare. About Sudan. And, you know, as a Sudanese person in attendance, it was really touching to see people in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Nairobi come out to support Sudan. The room was packed. We had songs, we lit a candle. It was a beautiful demonstration of solidarity. And at the event, I met the special guest to my left, Mus'ab Baba, someone that we've been in contact since. He presented a very powerful presentation. We did an Instagram live. In the Instagram live, everyone was saying, please, please, please put a link to the presentation. I've been asking for the link, you haven't put it yet, but I'm sure it'll come in the comments of this YouTube show. Mus'ab is a researcher and consultant who's worked with Sudanese civil society since 2000 and is a contributor to AIN Network, focused on digital media development in Sudan and the media sphere. And to my right, we have Kamal Ramadan, also known as General KD. Kamal has a beautiful name, such a beautiful name, I actually gave it to my son, Kamal Kabello. Kamal is a Sudanese artist who was based in the Nuba Mountains and went to Khartoum for the first time after Bashir was ousted in 2019. He's part of the Nuba Mountain Sound, an artist collective performed for crowds around Sudan before the war. Everyone, welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. Like I said, it's a very, very important topic we're talking about today. The UN has described this as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. They say 7.8 million people have been internally displaced, close to 2 million people externally displaced. The war's been going on for 10 months. It's now the worst place for food insecurity. 20.3 million people are facing high level of acute food insecurity in a population of around 45 million. So the situation is very, very dire, but it doesn't get the media attention it deserves. So Kamal, I'm going to start with you. How did we get here? How have we arrived in this mess?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So actually, you know, I'm glad, you know, to be with you here. And yeah, to say something also about my home, Sudan. Yeah, actually it is like my second time to be in Kenya. Yeah, there's war home, you know. There's war home, there's fight home. And like everybody is looking into a solution for it. Like all the youths and everybody out Sudan is like thinking, how are we like going to stop this war? So there's no like answers. You know, we are not getting answers, you know, we are trying, everybody's trying, we are trying with music, you know, but still, there's a lot of issues, you know, within our people. So we need like to, you know, to go and check ourselves first of all as a Sudanese, yeah, and then I think we will, yeah.
Okay. Mus'ab, when people talk about this conflict, they kind of start April 15th, 2023. And then some people might go a bit further and say, oh, you know, during the revolution, this was the origins of this conflict. But from your presentation that you gave, very powerful one, the roots of the mess that we're in today start a lot earlier than that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Could you touch on that, please?
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I mean, shout out to you and Seth and everybody at African Stream and the bigger kind of Pan-African movement that's happening here in Kenya. So thank you for having us, first of all. Yeah, you're right. I mean, people, when they want to analyze how the conflict has gone, you know, some people go to April 15th, some people go to 2019, some people go to 2011 when South Sudan became an independent country. But it goes beyond, it goes way before that. And if you want to draw kind of a trajectory of when this current mess, if we were looking at April 15th as like the boiling point of a huge war that's been kind of happening over a long period of time, you could trace it to the period of between the late 70s and the early 80s. You know, in Sudan, this was the moment that the Islamist movement in Sudan got a vice grip on the country, and they controlled the country, and they made certain people to be second-class citizens, and some people would be first-class citizens. On an international level, of course, people would recognize this time period as being the beginning of kind of the neoliberal project, where the entire political spectrum moved to the right, where you started seeing a lot of neocolonialism trying to take hold. There was a lot of the Cold War policies and everything. So Sudan was kind of caught within that, and the people that were kind of the handlers for these forces have been in power since that time. Every time they find a way to kind of survive. You know, at first they went to war with the South Sudan, and then it moved into the Blue Nile and Nuba Mountains area. It's probably KD when they were young. They've seen a lot of that. And then it started moving into Darfur. But then when it started to kind of, you know, solutions for the problems, their solutions are always solutions so that the central government can keep power. South Sudan wants to become a separate country, let it become a separate country as long as they stay in power. Darfur, 300,000 people died, no problem, as long as they stay in power. Go to war again with the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile, as long as they stay in power. People's revolution happens in 2018 and 2019, coerce it so that they can stay in power again. Of course, every time you start sweeping these problems under the rug, all that dirt under the rug starts piling up. Slightest misstep will blow it up. So this is now a war for control and for power among the Bashir factions. Like they were both part of the same government, and as soon as it became mathematically impossible to run a country with a military economy and repression and still having like militarizing entire communities and stuff, it was bound to happen, but people just didn't know when that boiling point would happen. So that's just kind of generally to kind of like see if we want to draw a trajectory to what led up to now, you know. And that's usually not an answer that people want, like a very quick kind of diagnosis. It's going to be hard to unpack, but because the problem of Sudan is pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you, Baba, for that. And if I can just do a bit of a follow-up on that, when we are speaking about the genesis of the crisis that we have in the Sudan, we have seen issues of economic deprivation, which is what led to people even coming up and, you know, going out to the streets. And now we have seen that Sudan has been listed as the country with the most uneven development in the world. And this is not to say that it is the most unequal, which is South Africa, or the country living in extreme poverty, which is Nigeria. And we see the capital of Sudan, which is Khartoum, is made up of three states of Omdurman, Bahari, and Khartoum itself. But most of the economic activities are centered around Khartoum, meaning that a lot of the people there would be very economically viable as opposed to people in the vaster regions of Sudan. Yes. And because of this, of course, there are people who thrive, when there are these oppressive regimes and they are living in opulence. This is equal to most of the wars we've seen, like in the DRC, the war that we're seeing now in Sudan and in other parts of the world, and especially in Africa. And these people, of course, whenever they're citizens of these countries, yes. And whenever they're discussing, of course, they say, oh, for example, it was better during the time of Mobutu Sese Seko when he was in Congo, or it was better during the time of Omar al-Bashir. What do you say about the people who actually are for these repressive regimes, citizens of the countries where there is war, like in Sudan? What do you say about these people, and also on the economic crisis?
Yeah. So this is kind of goes with, the whole idea of imperialism. You have people at the center of the empire who feel like they're part of the power structure of the empire. So for them, it's like, yeah, everything is going fine. We were happy. The dollar was 2.5 pounds. Yeah, you couldn't speak about politics, but we were living comfortably. But at that same time, when you go to places, marginalized places in the peripheries, even when you go to as far as Darfur or the Nuba Mountains or anything, it's a very different reality during those times. So it's kind of like the people who are at the center are usually very insulated from what's happening outside of that center. And you would see this in Khartoum for such a very long time. Even, and you're right, in Khartoum, the district itself, you'll find, crazy wealth. But even if you cross the bridge over into Omdurman, like where my family is from, you're going to see a very different reality as well. So it's kind of like, the center of the empire is always people who are going to argue for the structures of empire, the control of the police, the army. I mean, until this day, people are saying that, the National Army is still our national army. But, what has this national army done in the past, is the thing that's kind of not discussed right now. The RSF as a militia was the militia to keep the people in the periphery in check. The center of power used the militias, the Janjaweed, the RSF, as a way to quell rebellion and uprising in Darfur and in Kordofan and in these areas. So it's that whole view of someone who would argue and say that things were better under Bashir. There's 3 million dead people in Sudan who would say otherwise.
And how do we bring the gap closer, the economic crisis, because this is the genesis of everything that's going on, including the people who are coming out and they were democratically fighting for their rights, for example, in Sudan?
So that's a very, there's a huge debate in Sudan. Is it a material war or is it a cultural war? Which we get to the crux of the problem itself. The idea of identity, supremacy, if we're talking about, for example, Arab supremacy, I always tell people it's the illegitimate child of white supremacy. You know what I mean? Do you start looking at this problem as an economic problem, or are you looking at it as nations and peoples? So nations and peoples identify themselves with their culture and with their identity and everything. And there's freedom of association, of course, and there's, freedom of identifying with the group that you want to identify with. But what happens when identity, cultural supremacy is mixed with the tools of war? Economic warfare,
cultural warfare,
genocides. Like, until this day, you have an idea that the non-Arabic speaking, non-Arab groups in Sudan are inferior to the Arab groups in Sudan. This is, and I have to say so-called Arab groups, because Sudanese are all Africans.
Yeah.
Once you start getting into, your cultural identification, what you identify as, that's when it becomes a different story. And add to the fact to that you have this Arab supremacy that is actually enforced by other countries that just so happen to be other Arab countries that are enabling, these military, militias and the ruling class in Sudan for a very long time right now. So you get to a point where the line between the material analysis and the cultural analysis starts getting very blurry once there starts to become a long history and a pattern of this type of aggression and this type of, the human suffering that we're seeing in Sudan is extreme. We haven't seen it in a long time, but there's people that have been suffering in Sudan for a very, very long time based on these ideas of supremacy. Can you separate imperialism and neocolonialism from racial and cultural supremacy ideas or not? So at some point, it gets to the point where it's hard to make that distinction and say that the root of the problem is 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, there's the resource wars, and it's not separate from the rest of Africa. But at the same time, when we start looking at the cultural aspects of it and how long it's happened, we have one of our elite, thinkers, Bakr Adam Ismail. He wrote a book about the margin and the center and the periphery, and within the Sudanese context. And he says that most of the societies in Sudan are pre-capitalist societies. Means societies that their way of life and their way of how they live economically and everything have been in existence before an Adam Smith or before an Ayn Rand or anybody who was, talking about, ideologically talking about materialism and capitalism and things of that sort. So, we have a lot of heated debates in Sudan about that. So
I was about to say, because they're interlinked. It's not one or the other. If you look at the colonial project in Africa, they said it was a civilizing mission. They said that they were saving savages, but it was just about the resources. Yeah. That was just the lie that enabled them to extract the resources from the land. Now, when you have an uneven country and you have no desire to develop the places that need developing, the easiest thing to do is to say, well, they're not really Sudanese, they're, Africans, they're not like us. And you create a racial lie to continue the supremacist, elitist ideology. It's the easiest, straight out of the colonial playbook, divide and rule. And one of the places, which I'm going to move to KD in a second, where this has happened is definitely the Nuba Mountains. So if Sudan is the forgotten war, some would argue that the Nuba Mountains is the forgotten conflict in the forgotten war. As someone from the Nuba Mountains, I'm going to guess that most of our viewers have no idea what happened in the Nuba Mountains. Could you just give us a breakdown of what it was like growing up in the Nuba Mountains? What type of violence was, enacted on the people there?
So actually in 2011, when the war broke, I was actually in the Nuba Mountains, and I was like, young, but I could know anything, what's going on and all these things. It was tough days, and I never thought that we will again go back to war, because there was war since 90s, and then nobody was thinking again we will go back to war. It just happened So a lot of people from Nuba Mountain went to South Sudan. Some of them came to Kenya. We have even refugees in Kenya since 1998. They are in Kakuma. Even few months, last month even, I went and performed there to them. There's some of people, I met them, and I know them from Nuba Mountain. So it was this war, I don't know how to say it. It was the government is fighting its own people, The government is fighting its own people in There's army, and up there's planes. You know, you cannot sleep day and night. You cannot sleep. And we went even to the level even there's no food, you know. There's no food to eat. There's no like goods in the markets. The road is closed from south, from north. You know, the government like trying to capture Nuba Mountain like from everywhere. So it was like tough days, by the way. And in those days, like most of the youths like, you know, joined the SPLM North, so that they can defend, you know, their self, they defend their land, they defend their culture, they defend their, you know. So for me, I will just like wanted to say something. I met Musab in 2015 in the Nuba Mountains. Actually, if I haven't met like with them, there's him and there's also other friends. So I will have been like a military right now. I will be like in the army now fighting. Because this is the idea of, this is it. This is what the government planted in our heads, you know. So we know our enemy is from Khartoum. Every person in the Nuba Mountain knows that his enemy is from Khartoum. Like we are blaming everybody in the north that they are fighting us. So if I haven't met them, I will be like an army, you know, fighting right now. So I met them.
So not in the army, you would have joined one of the rebel groups.
Yeah.
The SPLM North is the Sudan People's Liberation Army.
And
in the north,
and actually, I never knew anything about Khartoum. I never knew even about Sudan, but I get to know about Sudan through them. You know, about Sudan, about Africa, about doing this, about, you know, and I get to know about Khartoum, and I get to know there's people from Khartoum who are against this war. They don't want this war. But right now, there's youths in the Nuba Mountain, they think that everybody in the north is their enemy. Yes. This is it. And this is what like went like I get to know these guys. You know, I started doing music, I started doing these things. So this is one of my like mission, you know, I'm working right now, you know, to the youths. I'm working on the youths like to tell them, yeah, this is like this. We have people in Sudan, we have people in Khartoum who are like against this war. And we have to like work together, all of us, so that we can like stop this war, we can get peace, you know. We unite, we do all these things. Because like we alone in the Nuba Mountains, we cannot manage this. We cannot manage this. Because we don't know anything about Khartoum. You need to have connection with people inside there who knows what was going inside there. And then you can be like able to change, to make change, to unite with the other places.
Thank you. I've got just a follow-up question. Yeah. So right now, a lot of Sudanese people online, they've created this kind of good and bad. So because the RSF are looting people's homes, the Rapid Support Forces, because they're using rape as a weapon of war, because they're committing all sorts of atrocities in the Darfur region and against different tribes, they've made it seem that the Sudanese army are the good guys, that we should all get behind the Sudanese army and support the Sudanese army. And what I try to remind them is, why don't you ask people from Nuba Mountains how the Sudanese army is? Why don't you ask people from South Sudan, Blue Nile, how the Sudanese army is? Do you have a message to some of those of us from the north about trying to paint the Sudanese army as these kind of heroes that's going to liberate Sudan from the terrible Rapid Support Forces?
No, there's nothing like heroes, you know. This actually, the Sudan government is the one who created the RSF. They are the one who created RSF. It is like, you know, a father and a son, something like that. You know, they know each other. Both of them, they have been like fighting people in the Nuba Mountains, Darfur, Blue Nile. They have been, you know, doing all this. So there is no difference between RSF and the Sudanese army. They actually want. I think what made them now fighting, it is just power. It's just power and the resources we have in Sudan and all this. But they don't have difference. Actually, what RSF is doing is the same what the government is doing. So they are all the same. I do remember like in 2016 there was like a huge attack on the Nuba Mountains. It was like in collaboration with the army and the RSF. So they were like saying, you know, you enter and don't leave anybody like alive, you know, something like that, you know. And it was like tough. You cannot sleep. You cannot sleep, you know, at night. Like in the morning when you get up, you must like hear the sound or the voice of Antonov coming, and then it bombs first. When it goes back, and then you will now feel safe that you will maybe take a tea. Now, you know, you got a new life, something like that, you know. I was like, you know, I don't eat. I just make sure they bomb first of all. Then when they go, you know, they have it like they bomb from in the morning, the midday, in the evening. You know, it is just like this. So there's no difference actually between RSF and the Sudanese Army. So they are both, you know,
two sides of the same coin.
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what
yeah.
you're saying, and
Yeah.
they're both.
Two cheeks of the same backside. That's how I like to put it.
Same difference. And with that, Kamal, and now I'll just go back to the musical part of it where we were speaking about earlier, and you coming from the Nuba Mountains, and we've also seen some of the videos of the music you've done, how on African Stream, we've featured some of them, and it's very good music. So in Swahili, we have a saying which says, usanii ni kioo cha jamii. Usanii ni kioo cha jamii. Yes, it's an old proverb, and it loosely translates to art is the mirror of society. So whenever you're doing any form of art, you're mirroring, one, your society, but two, you're teaching, you're educating, you're bringing about lessons, or also, you know, entertaining, but not just shallow entertainment. And we've seen the kind of work that you're doing in music in the Nuba Mountains. You've spoken about, if you would have not been an artist, then you'd have joined the rebels. And I'm so happy that you're an artist and you're able to pass this message in a cultural way that will be able to reach out to all the masses. And, you know, people will not be able to say, okay, this is from this side or this side, but they'll be able to take the music or other forms of art in whichever way that you give them. And maybe you can give us one bar so that we can hear. We can hear you.
So I have like,
of course, he has to.
I have like this song here. Well,
That's a beat.
no. Okay. أنهنا في سودان أنهنا بزي أو تبان وأنهنا في جبال أنهنا بزي أو كمان نلم سوا نعمل قوة نبني بلد نلم سوا نعمل قوة نبني بلد أنهنا في سودان أنهنا بزي أو تبان وأنهنا في دارفور أنهنا بزي أو كمان نلم سوا نعمل قوة نبني بلد نلم سوا نعمل قوة نبني بلد سودان جيرو. Yeah. The song is about unity. So it says that, you know, let us like unite and work together and build our country.
Thank
so,
you.
Yeah.
That's very beautiful.
Yeah.
And also you spoke about, of course, the refugees that we have here in Kakuma.
Yeah.
And of course, most of them, we've lived with them in society. We know them, and they're even integrated as part of our society. And we see that in Kenya, in the 2007, 2008 elections, we had something similar, though in a much smaller scale than what is happening in Sudan. But we had a lot of internally displaced people. There was war basically coming out from the elections, the disputed elections that happened then. And during this time, there was a specific song, especially from this artist, and he's called Eric Wainaina. He sang a song called Daima Kenya, and it was a very beautiful song. But at this time, there was a lot of ethnic tensions, and people were, of course, angry with each other and fighting and machetes and rape and a lot of things. But this one song was able to unite Kenyans. Like, people would sit somewhere and say, no, there's no need for us to fight. We are one country. And this music reminded the people of our patriotism, of who we are, that your neighbor is not your enemy. Even if this person is from another tribe, or even if this person is supporting somebody else, that they are not your enemy. And largely, this song would play and replay in the radio. And I think, in my opinion, it was one of the factors, that led to our stability coming back, but also in history, we see people like the ANC during the time when they were fighting for apartheid. There was so much music that they used to go. So yes, fighting against. Oh yes, my apologies. When they were fighting against apartheid, there was a lot of music that came out from this. One of them including this song that is almost a Pan-African anthem because it's sung across Africa. We see this with Fred Limo. We see this with the NRA in Uganda when they were also fighting, and they had rebels. And now you have this opportunity to use your music to be able to unite people. So what is the role of art and music when it comes to the war? And how can it be used as a tool to unify Sudan and to put an end to or minimize this war, to reach out to the masses and, curtail what is going on with the fighting?
Yeah, that's a good question, by the way, but it will take a long, for me to answer it.
Sure did.
So, yeah. So actually, there's love in music. Music has no boundaries. There's no border for music. So when you record a song, it will cross borders. It will go to other countries. Actually, I grew up in the Nuba Mountains, and I was doing music there, and I went and I recorded album in Uganda, and then in the coming 2 weeks, I just get some messages from people in Khartoum. They are playing my songs there. The new songs that I recorded them in Uganda, they are playing it. People in the US, they are playing it. Everybody's playing music. So music has no boundaries. It will cross, and everybody will. But the music must have a message. This is our problem. I think it is a Sudanese, artist problem, and also there is this issue of even artists. Our artists there. We have problems when we grow up like this. There's a lot of political parties. They are everywhere, push. When you grow up, you just be part of them. So right now, for me, if I'm one of these political parties and I'm doing music, the other people, they will say, KD is from that political party. He's just singing for them. No, I'm representing myself. I'm representing my people. I'm representing Sudan. I don't belong to any political party. So if, there's artists, actually for me, I haven't get enough opportunity. When I was in the Nuba Mountain doing music, actually, there's no social media there. When you do things, unless you go outside and then you try to share it with other people. You can maybe record a song, you stay with it for 2 years, and then someone in Khartoum will get to know it. But there is a lot of artists in Khartoum. There is a lot of, they have that opportunity of singing music of unity, singing music of this. But when you go, you get this one belongs to this political party, this one belongs to this political party. But for me, I believe that music and art will make a very big change, because when artists perform on the stage, audience from different counties, they can dance to the music. People need to come together. People need to come together and dance, and we stop that crazy thinking of this is when this music's it kills racism. It kills racism in people's hearts, in people's mind. It makes you feel you are enjoying your life. Even if you don't want to dance, you will be looking at someone dancing. You feel the way how he dances. You feel, this is peace. So, and right now, actually, we are we have been working with very many artists from Sudan, in their different places, from Darfur, Blue Nile, Nuba Mountain, even in Kakuma, in Uganda. We are doing this. We are working together to produce songs that talk about unity. That's we used to tell them, let us talk more about unity, about love, about how we can, let us work together. instead of like everybody's doing his own thing, let us like have one idea as an artist. We have problem there's fight going on, so I think we as an artist, if we unite and we work together, I think, and I'm very sure, we will make very big change in Sudan, and we will make a change.
Now, we've talked briefly about how the economic situation led to some of these conflicts, but you briefly touched on the elephant in the room, something that most Sudanese people don't want to talk about at all, and that's this manufactured dichotomy between Arab and Black African. How has it played out in these conflicts? Because I think when people hear from Kamal that the Sudanese army are bombing his village from the sky, it sounds unbelievable. But when you explain, the curse of racism and how it's affected Sudanese politics, it begins to make sense, because some of the worst crimes in humanity have been committed under this lie of racism. So can you explain conflict in Darfur, conflict in Blue Nile, conflict in the Nuba Mountains? How has this socially constructed Arab identity played into these conflicts?
Ooh, that's a long one.
A long but an important one.
But generally, just remembering that the birth of the modern Sudanese state was kind of hijacked by an elite that see themselves, if you talk about certain factions of some of these elite that have taken over Sudan from independence, they see themselves as the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. You know what I mean? Like, you see how once you have that kind of mentality, that ana min al al-bayt, and it's kind of like the ISIS thing. You know how ISIS, when they broke it up into, all of Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia and everything is al-Habasha. They go in Balad al-Kinana, is Egypt. So it's kind of the same thing, where it's like Africa is a place to be carved up and ruled. And Africans are people to be ruled by the cultural center, which for them was the Arab world. You know what I mean? Now, this white supremacy and European supremacy has had a lot of light shed on it because of the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of the Pan-Africans that came from the Western Hemisphere and stuff like that. But the Horn of Africa and East Africa has never had kind of like a civil rights movement to start evening the playfield, And that's, South Sudan didn't choose independence just because, they were sick of Bashir and only Bashir. It's because it's a widespread, deep-rooted problem that goes back. Now, how do these sentiments play out on the ground? I'll give you a small anecdote. We talked about that beginning of that neoliberal era, like the early 80s and stuff like that. This is where, someone like Hassan Turabi was talking about Sudan is the gateway to the rest of Africa, the gateway for Arabism and Islam to spread into the rest of Africa. So was this just rhetoric, or did they actually do something on the ground to actually make that happen? So you have institutions that popped up in the early 80s. Some of the institutions, if you take one example of it, there's something called Africa International University, Jamiat Afriqiya al-Alamiyya. The name is very misleading, because when you see the name, you're like, oh man, this is a Pan-African university. It's going to be beautiful. Go inside, there's going to be African stream and everything. But it was exactly the opposite. What it was the Council of Islamic Countries and Arab countries were basically funding this to be a university, to be that bridge that Turabi talked about. So who were the attendees of this university? Once you start looking at the leadership of, for example, al-Shabab in Somal, a lot of them went to Africa International University in Soba in Khartoum. Boko Haram in Egypt, in Nigeria. A lot of them went to this university over there because it was an expansionist idea. It wasn't just an idea of this is my identity and this is my culture and I'm proud of it. Nobody would have a problem if that was the case. But once it becomes a system of control and expanding that, everything you see, like as far as the war right now, the war with the South, the war with the Nuba Mountains, the war with Darfur, there's a common denominator in there of the issue of one of our thinkers calls it Islamo-Arabia, Islamo-Arabism, where the Islam, the religion part is used as like a sugar coat. The Trojan horse inside is Arab supremacy within it, to actually go in and start having a framework for domination, and domination of people within the immediate vicinity, but into the extended vicinity also. One of these extended vicinities is the Sahel region. So once these institutions started popping up in the early 80s, they started expanding westward, as well as south and to the east. Westward, then you started to get into Chad, Niger, Mali, and because there's already a background over there of, like, for example, Timbuktu being one of the oldest, libraries in Africa that was part of those, Muslim empires over there. So it was, once you start expanding that way, and at the same time you start recruiting militias to quell the opposition, that's where recruits from these areas also eventually became the RSF. So you take a small kind of idea, it's not a small idea, it's a big idea, but like, a simple idea of supremacy, but how does it actually play out on the ground? The economic incentives at that time, it was a long-term economic incentive, but initially it was the tactics and the tools that were used to kind of expand and subjugate Africans in the vicinity and like in the expanse of it. And that's why when this war broke out, the SAF has had almost like a post-colonial relationship with the Egyptian army.
Yes.
The Egyptian army had a very tight control over the SAF, where at the same time the RSF was squarely supported by the UAE in a big way. Now, is it a coincidence that both Egypt and the UAE were the ones who were pushing for a normalization with Israel? Out of all the Arab countries and out of all the Muslim countries, it was specifically the countries that also had an expansionist, mode of operation, who were like, okay, yeah, we want resources. We want to recruit young people from Darfur to go and fight in Yemen. We want to extract the gold from the gold mines over there. Egypt wants to make sure that Sudan doesn't make use of the GERD in Egypt and doesn't build any more dams, and at the same time getting a lot of produce and agriculture from Sudan. So it's almost like this mentality of supremacy made Sudan to be kind of a backyard for these countries. People ask about, for example, U.S. policy. What is U.S. policy towards Sudan? It's it's a policy by proxy. The U.S. is not gonna go against what the UAE and what Egypt and what Saudi Arabia want in the region. So they're gonna kind of give them the green light to kind of like deal with Sudan as a backyard. Now, there's a lot of reflection about this internally within the attitudes because the problem primarily is internally within Sudan, with how we perceive ourselves. What do we consider ourselves as? Do we look at ourselves as just being in Africa on the map, or do we look at ourselves as being Africans culturally, politically, and start looking economically how we can be part of Africa and stuff like that? That's been missing for the past 70 years. And I think when we talk about stopping the war and everything, I mean, there's a reason why, like, even the European countries and like a lot of the Arab countries, they were pushing Sudan to solve its problem in the IGAD and in the AU and solve it in Addis. And you have a lot of these political parties and the SAF and RSF people running around between Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia and Egypt and stuff like that, because the first, there's a lot of an element of a proxy war that's happening, but the people who are directly affected are the people inside of Sudan and their neighbors primarily, before anyone in the Arab Gulf or anything is affected by the war. So I think that is slowly kind of dawning on people that the modern state developed in a very uneven way, like Seth was saying earlier, very unequally. And that there was a very kind of center and periphery dynamic that was going on, but it's very intertwined with this issue of identity and who do we see ourselves as. And I think that's slowly dawning on Sudanese, even people who are supporting SAF, some people who are supporting RSF. I mean, there's tons of RSF people sitting in Uganda and coming to Kenya. Why do they feel more comfortable over here than going to Egypt, for example? So there is some kind of dynamic where there's some kind of realization that's starting to happening of the unification of Sudan. But it was kind of like Nairiri was saying, you know, nationalism is destructive and deadly if it's not Pan-African nationalism. You know what I mean? Yeah. So under that, guys, I think now there are some negotiations happening because both of these parties, SAF and RSF, know they can't keep this up. And they know how much hot water they're in right now.
And most of, I think to a large extent, like both parties, as you've spoken about, have expressed a form of contempt when it comes to the AU, for example, trying to resolve this conflict, which of course has not borne any fruit. And now I think I'll ask this in two ways because you've also spoken about some other issues that I'll delve into. So on the issue of the AU, how do we have these international bodies come in to help in the conflict, but also in the humanitarian and social crises such as food and the rape and sexual offenses and the schooling for the children, but also how do we educate now to unlearn and relearn and be able to bring about this integration of society? And maybe both of you can come in on this.
I think the main issue with the AU is that the AU members themselves are at war. Especially when you start looking at Sudan's neighbors. You know, you have Eritrea, now a lot of tension with Ethiopia. Ethiopia got Somalia angry because of the port issue with Somaliland. Egyptians are at war with Ethiopia, not physical war, but by proxy. You have Chad kind of, you know, kicking out Sudanese diplomats and taking them back. There's tensions within South Sudan. So our neighborhood is kind of, you know, very problematic right now, and there's a lot of internal conflicts going on with it. But that being said, that's why once you start zooming out into the African Union as a whole, we've been kind of talking as civil society to try and see, like, you know, there's this whole issue of doing advocacy. And whenever people hear advocacy, they think about going to Geneva or going to like one of these centers. But we're like, no, there needs to happen some local advocacy on the continent. Grassroots that funnels up to the various governments. You know, there is something to say about a push from the grassroots on the continent that would push the governments themselves to play a more active role. Now, you've talked about like the human suffering part and the sexual violence against women, the just fear, famine that might come up right now and everything. You know, the people who are tasked to protect the people and provide for them are the ones killing and robbing them. So it's like the Sudanese civilian who's inside of Sudan, unfortunately, does not have any kind of support or any kind of protection internally within Sudan. Now, that being said, like the SAF areas, the army areas are a little easier to live under than the RSF areas. You know, the RSF areas with communities that are from the RSF, it's easier to live over there. But if you're not from these communities and you're under RSF rule, just prepare for your house to be raided at any time and anything to happen and get robbed and women get raped. Like, it's a this was kind of the nightmare situation that the entire Sudanese, like, civil society and grassroots, all those people that came together in 2018 and 2019 to remove Bashir, this is the worst case scenario that could have happened. And because there's been a lot of compromises, a lot of coercion, and a lot of countries that didn't want to see a democratic civilian Sudan. So they supported these military forces by doing that. The African Union kind of has to be pushed in a direction to play a bigger role, and they can't play it by themselves. They could, but I think there needs to be a little bit more international coordination. The UN is starting to become a little bit paralyzed, I think, by what's happening in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Congo, in all these areas. And there's a political problem now with the UN. There's a political issue where you have, unfortunately, in the Western world, you have the rise of the right-wing movements, which is going to be a real problem going forward, because there's going to be less support for these UN bodies, and there's going to be more support for their domestic problem. Because, like, if you take the U.S., for example, as an example, it does look like Trump might win and come back. And they're talking about, hey, we don't want to send money to anywhere around the world. We need to secure our borders with Mexico, and create a new force within the immigration and custom enforcement and everything, where they're going to do border control and start doing raids on communities to see who's there legally, who's not there. The internal politics of these countries is going to reflect on what these international bodies are able and not able to do. Sudan, the needs are around $4 billion. There's been about less than $2 billion, I think, that's been pledged. But so far, a fraction even of that has actually made it through. And part of it is because these international bodies are telling the international community that there's no way to bring in aid if the RSF is going to rob them, or if SAF is going to take that aid and then push it to its political bases and not, give aid to certain communities and ignore certain communities and stuff like that. So even our heart goes out to kind of, the people on the ground and the humanitarian workers who see that need and are trying to push it forward. But that being said, there's a huge grassroots volunteer effort inside of Sudan. This is the same kind of volunteer grassroots effort that when, after removing Bashir, started working on the ground and started wanting to rebuild the country. But it's not enough. There still needs to be ultimately a stop to the war. That's the biggest question mark right now. Like KD was saying earlier, everyone outside of Sudan is working on how do you actually stop the war? Now, there's a couple of different routes. The politicians are going more towards a power sharing deal. Another power sharing deal where they would tell the SAF and the RSF, okay, let's form a national government, and we be there, and it's a transitional period, and then we'll work it out from there. But most of Sudan is looking around like, after all of this, you're still going to bring these warring parties and give them power and put them in a government again. So, it's a complicated situation. And there are some shortcuts to stop the war and everything, and the power sharing and everything, but will that bring back a war that's worse than what we've seen? Or will it actually bring peace? Because there's also the issue of justice and accountability. It's there's not a lot of appetite for talking about justice and accountability in this situation right now with this level of human suffering, but a part of me always feels like, well, that's kind of the point of oppression, is to make you get down on the floor, beg for just, survival, and not hold anyone accountable. You know what I mean? Just that effort of there's some kind of dynamic of military powers punishing the civilians for speaking up and wanting to get their rights. So the African Union has to be the place to exert pressure on. Now, that being said, there are some other factors, like, for example, the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries, they've added Egypt and Ethiopia into the fold. They're a little hush-hush about it. They're not very vocal about what the strategy is, but it seems like it's a way to contain the conflict in the region. I mean, they could have added Nigeria, being a huge economy. You know, they could have added other countries like Congo as far as the potential, the economic potential. But I think within the BRICS countries, they were very kind of targeted, but very particular about bringing in Egypt specifically, Egypt and Ethiopia, because these are also countries that are playing a part within the conflict inside of Sudan. So if they, and when you look at also the other Middle Eastern countries that were added, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. Also, when you forget about Sudan for a second, if you look at the Middle Eastern conflicts in general, a proxy war between Sunni and Shia and everything over there. So it also seems like it's a strategy to, I don't know how it will play out or where it will go, but I do know that Sudanese have been relying and pleading to the UN and to the World Bank and to all of these international bodies for the past decades. But I don't think we should even hold our breath for these bodies to come in, because there's a Security Council that we don't have a say in. We don't, as Africans in general, we don't have a say in the Security Council and what gets decided within these bodies and how they move and who they're supporting, who they're not supporting. So I think within the African Union, and even if you know, the East African community, I always tell Sudanese, like, we need to kick in the door and get into the East African community by any means necessary. You know, the IGAD is cool, but the IGAD is, you know, on development. The East African community is a community that should have complete integration within it. So South Sudan is in there right now. There's no reason why Sudan cannot be within.
Just joined as well.
Somalia has just joined. The Congo has joined. So it makes sense for a country like Sudan to join in. Now we have to go in Sudan and see who has those hang-ups about not wanting to be part of the East African community. So it's, you know, we don't have any
My concern
simple
is that
answers.
when I was in Sudan and the economic crisis after the revolution, the older generation were already fed up. They're already saying, what did all this revolution get us? You know, price of bread has gone through the roof. Fuel, we can't get fuel. We can't get anything. So, and that was before there was any, you know, violence in Khartoum, Bahri and Omdurman. My concern now is 10 months of violence, over 13,000 people officially who have been killed. The number's probably a lot higher than that. As we said, 20 million people facing food insecurity and over 8 million people displaced internally and externally. What do you think that, you know, we've highlighted that RSF and the Sudanese Army are both problematic, but do you think at this stage people have become fatigued and that all they want is, you know, maybe the Sudanese Army to take a decisive victory, and if it means going back to military dictatorship, anything's better than the situation now? That's not my words, but are you worried as someone that's been organising in civil societies, that's tried to raise a consciousness about what can be? Are you worried that this conflict has taken us so far back in terms of building a new Sudan, a more prosperous Sudan, a Sudan without these kind of racial and tribal differences? Do you think that's further away now than it's ever been, or closer than it's ever been?
That's a complicated question, but I think in general that the war has kind of been a wake-up call for a lot of people around Sudan. Now, the sheer terror and the horror of war, it's natural that people take sides. You know, for example, there's a big debate right now of should people pick up arms to defend their specific areas or not. You know, and this becomes like a natural instinct. You know, if you have a militia that's coming and that's gonna attack, then it, you know, as far as organizing in your community and picking up arms and defending yourself against it becomes a natural human instinct rather than a political issue. Now, there are a lot of groups in Sudan that have picked up arms, but they're not with SAF. They're not with the army. They organized around tribal lines, which is still scary, you know, which is still, you know, not something that should happen in the 21st century, but that's the reality that these governments within the center have created. Now, we often forget that for the past decades, there have been groups that have been squarely against, whether it's SAF or RSF, and they've picked up arms and they've actually fought against them. If you take a lot of the Darfur armed movements, for example, they haven't joined the war. They actually have a joint force that's in al-Bashir and in these areas that are protecting the markets, protecting civilians, protecting these people. The SPLM North in the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile has been protecting civilians and facilitating aid for a very long time. So you do have other options that are outside of the SAF and RSF dichotomy that are qualified and from their track record have shown that they can actually protect civilians. They can be a peacekeeping force. We don't have to bring a peacekeeping force from outside of Sudan. You have these forces that are qualified to be a peacekeeping force, but neither side of the conflict actually want that to happen, nor the countries that are supporting them. People out of the survival instinct right now are looking for a leader, a strong man to come and end this war. But the problem is you have two warring sides. Each civilian on these sides are looking at they are wishing for their strong man to actually take over and govern the place. Hemdeti was just in Rwanda a couple of weeks ago. So he went to the Genocide Museum. And he was, you see him looking at the pictures at the Genocide Museum, and the look on his face, it's like there's a million thoughts going through his head. But ultimately, it does seem like he wants to be a Kagame. He wants to be a strong man who ended the genocide and who's ruling Sudan and with an iron fist and just focusing on development and just shut the F up and here's some food, here are some roads, here's some health care, here's some this, which a lot of people, their natural instinct, they're fine with that. Yeah. They're like, if I have basic services offered to me, then I don't need to speak about politics. Yeah. I don't need to speak about freedom, justice, and equality. I don't need these things. I could go to work, I could come back, I could put a roof over my head, I can put some food on the table and everything. So that's always going to be there. There's always going to be the instinct for people who say, if we have the basics, I don't care what happens on the government level or with politics or anything like that. But the problem is we know where these things lead in the Sudan context. You know what I mean? So the people that you see that are very loud about supporting SAF and it's going to get rid of RSF, first of all, SAF is not going to get rid of RSF. That's mathematically, it's impossible. By force, to get rid of them is impossible. It's impossible for the RSF by force to get rid of SAF. There's a deadlock that's happening right now. And we have to remember also the networks that are actually have financial gains and benefits with both of these sides. There's, for example, you have the NISS, the National Intelligence and Security Services in Sudan. For the past 40 years, they've been oppressing, detaining, coercing, and making a lot of money out of businesses that are part of the NISS. 2019, they were gone, but they stayed there in the shadows. These are some of the factions that are very loud about the war and about supporting the actual military effort of taking sides with either ones of these. But I think inherently, the Sudanese know that since 2019, it still was a military government. Yeah. You had Hamdok there, and you had some political parties over there, but who controlled the country's resources? Who controlled the foreign policy? Who controlled all of these different facets of government? It was still the military, and that's what the youth in the streets were actually talking about. They were saying al-askar lis-sakanat wal-janjaweed itḥal. The military has to go back to the barracks, and the janjaweed, the militias, have to be disbanded. This is what they were screaming since 2019. Yeah. So in the immediate future, you're going to see a lot of that. Yeah. You're going to see a lot of people are this 2018 uprising was a mistake in the first place. It destabilized our country, it caused the war and stuff like that without looking at who actually was pulling the strings start the war. I'll send you a report that we've done in early 2023, which was about the race for recruitment between SAF and RSF in places like Darfur. This is before the war. So they were winding up. They were getting ready to actually go through this war, and I think because they thought that their countries that are backing them would allow them to have a decisive victory. But now with this stalemate, I think there's a lot of reflection that's happening. Yeah. People are starting, like, the people who want to stop the war are more than the people who want some kind of military victory in Sudan.
So we've been going on for an hour, so we're just going to ask concluding questions and then we'll wrap up. But I have to talk about a conspiracy theory that I've seen online and just get your thoughts on it, really, because when you were speaking and analysing what's going on, it's hard not to at least reflect on the conspiracy theory and its merits. And the conspiracy theory goes like this. Part of the transition to democracy was trying to untangle Sudan's economy from the Sudanese Army and from the RSF. The RSF controls the gold mines. The Sudanese Army controls all of the other industries in Sudan. So what many people say is the coup that removed Hamdok, that happened at a time where there was this unit set up specifically to go after and untangle Sudan's economy from these two forces. And as soon as that happened, there was a coup, and then it would shut this stuff down. Now, both of these guys were friends. They both fought together in Yemen. They both fought together in Darfur. So some people have been saying that this is coordinated. Come together, F everything up, destabilize the country. When we come back and we make peace and we sign some sort of treaty, no one will try to go after our money again. The industries will remain in the same places.
They just want to thin the herd.
Yes, exactly. Now, obviously, there's no evidence of this. It's hard to prove. We don't have any documents or text messages between. What do you think about that, and why do you think that conspiracy theory has got so much traction?
I think it's because most people didn't realize just to what extent exactly these guys have been militarizing not just the economy, but the societies themselves. If you're sitting in Khartoum, you are not aware of what kind of discourse that Hemdeti was using to arm tribes in Darfur. You don't know what Burhan was doing with the Islamists in the east and in these areas to get them ready for this war. They've been winding up for a long time. And for anyone who actually has that idea that they're gonna come back and just, like, you know, make a deal and everything, just look at the social dynamics. You have people from the north and the east saying that from now until Judgment Day, we're gonna be chasing down these Arabs from the west, meaning the RSF constituency. And you have people from these RSF communities, from their bases, saying that we're gonna completely eliminate the 1956 country, which means the Arab Rivarians who live along the Nile, who we've been protecting for all this time, from the Mahdiya days, that their rule, their time is over, and we're going to come after them, and they're not going to live in this country. The amount of hate and the amount of animosity that this war has instilled on top of the animosities that are already available makes it kind of impossible for these two to come together and do a deal and say, you know, we're going to have military rule and we're going to control our military areas and just all you civilians get out. They are looking for third parties to come between them and actually separate them. So it's
past the point of no return.
It's past the point of no return, but it's a pretty juicy conspiracy. So I can see why people are spreading that.
Kamal, before we wrap up, any thoughts about, you know, how we move forward? Any message, not just to the audience, but to the rest of the Sudanese people about how we move forward? How do we get past, you know, the crimes of the past? How do we, beyond this conflict between the RSF and the army, how do we build a new Sudan?
Okay. So for me, it's like when a lot of Sudanese now, a lot of them are saying, like, these people must to be held accountable, like the RSF and the government, and the Sudanese government. So if you want to do this, which means that we are going to kill all the RSF and plus the Sudanese army. They have been committing crime, for long years. Where to? So if you want to take them, we are going to take all of them, For me, this is my personal thinking. This is what I do think about it. And I used to tell other people also, other Sudanese, I used to tell them, we have been suffering a lot. We suffered. We are tired of fighting even. We are tired of running to other countries. There's also issue of we as a Sudanese, we are more connected to Arabs than Africans. When you go to Khartoum, actually it was my first time to visit Khartoum in 2019. So I got my family there, my own family. Even they are more connected to Arab than Africans. Even one of my brothers is here right now. Is my cousin. Now he want to travel to Arab countries. He want to go and work there. He doesn't want to stay here, because he grew up he was doing all these things, traveling. His father was traveling to Arab countries doing. So I used to tell people let us get connect to Arab to Africans, because we look like them exactly. We look like them exactly, and their style of living, it is peace. In the Nuba Mountains, people are living, in peace. There's Muslims, there's Christians, there's non-religion people, there's people who drink alcohol, but they are all living together. They don't have problems. But when I was in Khartoum, there's all these things, don't drink alcohol. Alcohol is haram. You've been drinking here, military, police come here and take you. And I used to tell people we need everybody should concentrate on his own self. You build yourself, you build your own peace. Don't think of someone the other people. This one is Christian, this one is taking alcohol, I don't want to be with him. Is smiling what? No, if he's smiling, just move to other place, give him his space even. Let him do his things. And for me, we need just, reconciliation. This is my, because if we want to judge all these people, we are going to kill half of or quarter of Sudanese. Yeah, because they have been working together with these politicians. They have been working, even all of them, they have committed crime. So if we are going to judge them, but what we need from them, we need them to calm down. We need the people, the civilians, let them give power to the civilians, let civilians rule, and then for them, we are not going to do anything with them. We know you have been killing people, you have been doing, so we cannot kill Hemdeti alone and leave al-Burhan. We cannot kill al-Usman Mamata and leave Nafi. No. If you want to judge, we must judge all of them, because they have been killing people in Darfur and in the Nuba Mountains. If there is any judgment, it must be equal. And if we need peace and we need to go on, we let us forgive each other, and we build a new Sudan. And this is my personal thinking. This is,
That's beautifully put.
There is a thing to say about, there's a growing grassroots movement that's looking for more of a transitional justice framework that would include what Katie is talking about, which is truth and reconciliation as being one of them. Sudanese, we have a lot of homegrown traditional justice mechanisms where it's not just bringing someone and cutting off their head. It's no, you two or have a fight, come and in front of the elders, state what your problem is with this person. What is your problem with this person? But what have you done? The truth part. What have you done? Who? And this has to be based on the people who are actually victims of these wars. So there's 3 million IDPs inside of Darfur before the war. who are waiting for some kind of mechanism where there has to be truth and reconciliation. And the Sudanese public, a lot of times, we're very forgiving. So if someone comes and says, I have done 1, 2, 3, but I was getting orders and I didn't mean to do 1, 2, 3, 4, there could be a forgiveness on this issue, but there has to be a mechanism where, like Katie's saying, it has to be equal. It has to be a national mechanism.
Definitely. And I'd just add to that, I took my friend with me to Sudan, I think 2015, and he was just amazed by the diversity of people. And when you have Sudanese food, there's diversity of cuisine. You listen to the Sudanese music, there's diversity of music. Diversity should be our strength, but we've allowed it to be weaponized by the elites to divide us against each other. I think once we, respect the ethno-religious diversity of the country and use it as PR about how great our country is, how beautiful our country is. You can see Sudanese people standing up, 5, 10 people in the line, and they all look different. They all have slightly different customs that they bring from the different regions of Sudan. That's something that we need to embrace, and we need to move away from, as you said earlier, the term you used was Islamo-Arabism. And, when Numeri, I think it was in 1983, imposed Sharia law on a multi-religious society, it was a recipe for disaster. So, yeah, we need a more broader revolution that includes all the people from Sudan, that doesn't park the grievances of people from Nuba Mountains and Darfur and says, we'll talk about that another day, we just need to remove Bashir, and actually, tries to understand what the root causes of it are. And that's the way I think that we move forward. So for any final thoughts?
I think you guys have said it all from the, I would call it truth and justice and reconciliation, as it's been called in other places, and we hope that it works. And the same thing he's saying, to bring in the civil society and the grassroots activists who are coming in, and even what you're saying about unity in diversity. And I think that is the most profound, that there is unity in diversity, and that diversity is not a thing to divide or to take people apart, but to bring them together. And the minute that the Sudanese people will be able to see their diversity as, something to unite them, then they'll be unstoppable. I mean, the three of you are all Sudanese, and you all look different, basically, and you are an example of that unity and diversity by coming here today, speaking from different viewpoints, and also all of you wanting a united Sudan. So mine is to just hope that this will also resonate with the Sudanese people, and that they will use this as a strength, and with that, then we can find an end to this war.
Perfect note to end on. Well, there's so much we didn't really get into because of time, so we'll have to invite you guys on again. As we end all shows, I've been Ahmed Kabelo.
Steph Usani.
Musab Baba.
General KD.
Until next time.
Peace.
Yeah,
Peace.